go ahead and turn the first one on. Can you all hear me? Let me try again. Is the microphone warm? So if you can't hear me, it's better. Would you go ahead with that? This afternoon I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects. If you could turn it down just a little bit. This is a paper I gave at the TREAT conference 6 years ago in Virginia Beach. Now, how many were there at that event? I know a few people have been there. Years ago, I met Dr. Bob Beck, who many of you may know or know of, and he was my mentor in the miniaturized electronics devices that included a EEG biofeedback unit. And initially, I decided, this was in the mid-70s, and I decided to buy one of his units to do EEG biofeedback training on my own brainwaves. That was an experience in itself, and every noon time I'd go out to the parking lot at work, and I would spend 20 minutes to half an hour hooked up with the EEG and listening to the brainwave. And I'll explain a little more about his system in a few moments, but after a month or so of doing that, I wasn't sure if I'd achieved what I did, but as an engineer, I realized that I was actually learning to meditate. Now, I could not have learned to meditate without the tool, but having a tool like this, I actually learned to meditate. And just as a side thought, I went off to one of the meetings, many meetings I had in Washington, D.C. from California. And one day, I couldn't see the slide. It was totally out of focus. And finally, in frustration, I took off my glasses. And I'll be darned if it was in perfect focus. It somehow, whether it relieved the tension on my eyes at the time, it allowed me to go glasses free for quite a few years. And I thought that was just an interesting side effect. Now, I call this talk my MAW and PAW talk. MAW stands for mental access window, and PAW, partial access. So, in the world of the aerospace business, we use acronyms, for everything. And certainly, remote viewing is IRVA, and you're going to see a lot of acronyms in my talk. Now, I apologize for that because I frankly don't like all the acronyms, but in this case, the MAW and PAW is part of my humor, too. And so if you'll go to the, I'm going to talk briefly about the Earth's Schumann resonance and what I think that means, and how that interacts with our brain waves and everything on Earth in general. Get into my definition of what I use for the brainwave frequencies, and then Beck's system, and it was my son that inspired me to write the software to actually run the fast Fourier transforms. That's what FFTs mean. And I'm going to show you my results of that and sort of groupings that I've done. And it's sort of interesting, but it's not statistically valid sample. And certainly, just as a side again, I was giving a talk up in Minnesota one time about results of my remote viewing experiments, and I had very significant results, and I was going on and on and on about the statistics and the single-tailed p-value that Jessica talked about this morning. And somebody went up to the board and drew a picture of this sort of half bird, half rat, and she turned around and said, "There is your single-tailed p-value." And so not everybody fully appreciates statistics. Then the little interesting thing about the brainwave patterns of millionaires and my own out-of-body experience using this equipment, and finally my contention is that type of experience leads to improved creativity. So we'll talk briefly about that, and I think there'll be time for questions, and let's just have some fun with this. So the Schumann resonance, this is the brainwave frequency. This is my definitions. A lot of people use these, but I'm sure there are other versions. The delta between 0 and 4 hertz, obviously you don't want to have 0 because then you've passed away. Theta is 4 to 8 hertz, and alpha starts at 8 hertz up to 14, and then higher than 14 is, in the old days at any rate, considered beta. And I'm not that familiar with the gamma, although I have tested 4 people now that have increasing brainwave frequencies from 14 hertz on up to 120 hertz. That's where my system cuts off. And one was a guy that I, at a PK party, which hopefully a lot of you will experience tonight, who was able to hold a fork and simply pull it apart. And, you know, that's fairly impressive in the laboratory. And took 800 pounds to pull a similar fork in the tensile test part. So, but this guy had that unique brainwave frequency pattern of this increasing power in his higher and higher frequency brainwaves. And then at the TREAT conference, there were 3 ladies who were teaching yoga, Tantra yoga, I think, and they all had that unique pattern. So I don't have a copy of that here to show you today, but it's there are some people that have that. The next slide is let me talk a little bit about the Schumann resonance. In 1952, German mathematician Schumann had the idea that the Earth's magnetic field oscillated. And basically he said that if you look at all the lightning bolts all over the world, they're about 100 per second. And if the EMP, electromagnetic pulse, emanating from a lightning bolt was running around in between the hard Earth and the D layer of the ionosphere, and if it was traveling at the speed of light, it would run around the Earth at the equator 7.81 times per second. And if it runs around the poles, it would run around 7.83 times per second. Now, if any of you have read my paper, whoever calculated that had a different radius of the Earth than I did. But you know, my problem is I'm in aerospace, so we use the Earth quite a bit for satellites and stuff like that. But nevertheless, it's close. And I'm going to be talking about that frequency band as the mental access window. The facts of the matter are that EMP running around between the hard Earth and the ionosphere causes the magnetic field of the Earth to oscillate. And these are actual recordings from I believe the Bureau of Standards. Let me back up a second. It was in 52 that Schumann postulated that the magnetic field lines would oscillate. It was in 62 the National Bureau of Standards actually had an early version of the squid magnetometer that was sensitive enough to actually measure it. And these are recordings that they measured. And those of you that have done brainwave analysis, EEG analysis, let's see, that's electroencephalogram. but you see a kind of a familiar looking thing. You see these periods where there's a higher power of the signal, and that would usually associate with an alpha burst. But it runs along, and there's just a lot of similarity of the Earth's magnetic field vibration and compared to the brainwaves. So it's no mistake that we get interested in sort of the idea that, gosh, if the Earth's magnetic field has been vibrating since the beginning of the Earth, all the things on Earth are being affected by this, including people and our brains. And then it's interesting that people have measured shaman brainwaves and meditators' brainwaves and healers' brainwaves and all over the Earth, and they find some interesting characteristics about when they get into their special state. They find that their brainwave frequencies are close to these. Now, in the old days, 60s, when the brainwave activity got exciting, the instrumentation wasn't accurate enough to be able to say 7.81 hertz. That's hundredth of a hertz, which takes a very, very accurate instrumentation. But in the mid-70s, we were getting to the types of instruments that could actually measure down to that quality. So it's no mistake that Andrei Puharich, for example, used to talk about 8 hertz as the area that people did special things. And so the next slide shows something that's characteristic, I hope, of the frequency. Go ahead. Got that one right. And so what you see here is the fundamental frequency of the Schumann resonance with octaves being carried out at higher frequencies. So interestingly enough, we find special windows in frequency occurring at around 14 hertz and 21 hertz and so on. So it's not just a phenomena that's down at the 7.8 region of the frequency domain. This particular work was measured in 76 in a CIA report, but it was Dr. Beck that made me familiar with this work, and probably some of you have done it as well. Now, I want to talk about Beck's EEG biofeedback system. he has a thing about making everything very small, portable. And yesterday I had it set up in that room over there to where I measured 6 or 7 people's brain waves. I did not bring my complete system, which I'll talk about, but the recording part of it is this thing without the oscilloscope. I didn't bring an oscilloscope. But basically, it's very old technology, and some of the other talks you're going to hear about EEG analysis, they are using much more modern technology. Beck's very, very clean amplifier, and we've tested that in the laboratories with the best of equipment, and they are amazed at how clean his amplifier is, because he individually tunes each one of his amplifiers. But basically, we simply put the electrodes to measure the voltage differential between the forehead and the occipital lobe in the back, and it's on the midline, and there's no grounding to the ear and all that other stuff, and because he made very, very sensitive electrodes, we just use salt water to get the connection to the skin rather than the goop that if you've done the medical approach. So you get voltage from here, which is put into the EEG biofeedback unit, and then it superimposes the EEG analog data onto a 2,000 hertz tone using a FM type process, so that you can save the data on a regular tape recorder. So that puts it right up in the middle of the auditory region, and so a standard tape recorder can record the data. In this case, I guess there'll be a later slide that'll show this, but in order to get the analog data back off, I have to run that data through a discriminator, which pulls off the 2,000 hertz tone, and then into the computer that has what's called an A to D board. That means analog to digital conversion. And the software picks up that signal and captures 20 seconds worth of data, which it runs an FFT, fast Fourier transform, on each second, and then plots it in what's called a hidden line three-dimensional presentation, and I'll show you that. The software my son and I wrote back in the mid-'70s, and we haven't changed it, except every time I change computers, which most of you know happens about every 3 years, you get a new computer, and so depending on the language, I have to convert it to the more up-to-date language. But at any rate, this is his particular biofeedback unit. You can watch your EEG on a medical class oscilloscope, and all this is battery powered, of course, so that people aren't hooked up to the 110 volt standard biofeedback rules. Okay. The next slide is what this system looks like when I just took a 7.81 hertz signal generator and generated the input. And you basically can see what I'll call, this is three-dimensional now, so frequency is along the bottom axis, and you can see that you can really only see that it's around 8 hertz, but the way it's calibrated, you get a fairly clean, signal coming through this entire system. There's lots and wires, and you see a minor octave down here, but that's a very clean signal in the signal processing world. So the next slide is what the EEG of a I call it a focused engineer. Now this happens to be me, but so I didn't put that in the paper, you know. So, and what you see is, and this is when I've gotten into a fairly relaxed state, and because I did EEG training, I'm able to move my primary frequency around. I can move it. It normally is up here around 13 hertz, even when I'm doing analytical things. And when I want to do remote viewing, I move it down to about where it is, as you see on this slide. So I'll talk about a very narrow bandwidth and frequency of this type of person. I tend to associate trainers. A lot of trainers of various types that I've measured have this kind of brainwave. I believe John Alexander has a similar brainwave pattern, and Elizabeth Rauscher, for those of you that know her. But we'll just call this the teaching trainer type brainwave pattern. And now to show you a quite different type of brainwave pattern. This is a woman who had been hit by lightning. And she has what I'll describe as a very wide bandwidth in frequency. As you can see, it covers the spectrum. And it turns out that there's a lot of special windows that in frequency, that when your brain waves are synced up to those windows, then in the case of the MAW, which is what I'm describing as the mental access window, people like this are getting flashes and data from accessing data remote from them all the time. Where if I'm in the alpha state, I don't get any of that flash type information. But similarly, you see beta all the way up into the beta. This is the way this person is almost all the time. And I've done a lot of people who claim to be psychic, and they all seem to have broad, high bandwidth brainwave patterns. Now I am going to show you an example of one that's not exactly like that, but let's see what the next slide is for kicks. This is a bright teenager. It's my son. And now he's showing a lot of frequency up here in the 10 to 12 region, but he also has this huge amount of theta and delta even going on, which experts in this area tell me is typical of teenagers where their brain stem is still growing. Now, this is interesting, I think, because of this growth, that they're getting information in these special windows, and so learning quickly should not surprise you, because their brain is getting a lot of data from the magic window by virtue of just the nature of growing up. Now, it's not to say us older folk lose all that, but but it's sort of a natural thing. So the next one is a woman who is another psychic. Now, she happened to be one of these psychics that gives readings on the radio. They call in and so on. And her brainwaves are all in the magic window almost all the time. Now, it's a wonder she isn't totally schizophrenic, because living in this reality is obviously has to be difficult for her, because she's getting all this data from out there. And I hope I'm being clear about this. The next slide, please. Well, I did mention that mine was taken when I was in the remote viewing state, so they should be very similar. Mine in my normal focused engineer state actually is higher frequency. But it looks like that. It's always has this very narrow bandwidth case. Now, here, because I've done a fair amount of this over time, there were people that came along that were millionaires. Now, that used to mean something, 10 years ago. And I think I'm going to have to change the threshold on my questionnaire, because last year's stock market was pretty good for people. So what we're seeing here, I found incredibly interesting. These millionaires had a different kind of pattern than a lot of these other folks. It's a little hard to see in the picture I have here, but when I've dissected these pictures, I see two primary frequencies, not just what we're used to thinking of as a single primary frequency. And obviously with the wide bandwidth people, they have many frequencies going on, but this is a bimodal type pattern. And one frequency band is up in the alpha, and then the other one, that's a little hard to see, that's behind it, is right in the mental access window. So let's see what that means. It means that they do well in society, relaxed state, grounded, and they've got another frequency going on in the mental access window, so it shouldn't be a surprise that money just comes and is something that's generally fairly easy. And these are all self-made millionaires. Now, since that time, I have added this question to my questionnaire: are you a millionaire? And the people who have checked yes, and there's been 5 of them, they've all had this same pattern, which I find fascinating. It's not a huge sample, but it's interesting. And when I talk about this, I always get people volunteering to have their brainwaves trained for this pattern. So maybe there's an application there. The next slide, please. So this, in addition to the recording the brainwaves part of my simple old system here, Beck's system, this is the part where when I play back the tape recording the brainwaves, I put it through a discriminator to take that 2 hertz tone off, and then I have to put it through another box which takes a 4.5 volt bias that he puts out of his little box, and can adjust it so that on the monitor and the computer, it provides a good data. And then it runs through this D board I mentioned, and I first was doing this with an old Apple that had an A to D board in it, 75 points per second. And that's really old technology for those of you that know of this kind of technology. So after the program does the fast Fourier transform analysis and makes it, then we can print it. Those of you that want to see what your brain waves look like, tomorrow I'm going to, as much time as there is between talks, I'm going to be in that room over there measuring people's brain waves. And I will take it home, take the recording home, and run it through the display part of the system. And this sort of contingent on when I get the A to D board working right now. It had been 6 years since I used the system, and when I fired it up, didn't work. But it will, it will. It just takes a lot of time and effort. But at any rate, then what I'll do is mail people their brainwave pattern and write a little bit about what I think. I think I know brainwaves that seem to be in healing categories. You can see that there's this major difference between people have narrow frequency bands versus the wide frequency bands. And it's my contention that we can learn a lot based on our brainwave frequencies. So then, one of Beck's suggestions was, heck, Jack, why don't you listen to your own brainwaves in one ear? And we made a tape recording of what 7.81 hertz sounds like when put through his biofeedback EEG unit. And at that time, I was more of a risk taker, and so I listened to both of them, my brainwaves and the 7.81 hertz in this ear. And much to my surprise, that I could actually tell when those two sounded exactly the same. They went into phase, actually. And at that moment, I popped out of my body. I was floating over a tennis court, and that was quite an experience. And now, I actually had an experience where, as I was floating there looking at this tennis game that was going on, and I do admit that I was a tennis player, but I wasn't sure which club that court belonged to, nor did I recognize the people playing. But when this tennis ball came right at me, it frightened me so that I apparently jumped out of the chair that I was sitting on, with all these wires hanging down. And that, of course, slammed me back into my body because of that movement, instantly. And I haven't done it since. However, a lot of people have come to my home and had this happen. That is, they got all hooked up, and about 50% of them have had either full-blown or partial out-of-body experiences. One psychiatrist came to the house once, and he didn't believe in all this stuff, but he wanted to be hooked up. And so I hooked him up, and as he was listening to the 7.81 hertz and so on, his description of his anecdotal description of his experience was that his arm began to separate. You could see his out-of-body arm, versus physical arm, and it frightened him. So he basically moved and stopped it. But after that point, he became very good at various variety of computer programs I've made that are statistical in nature, sort of simple tests of ability. And we went from never getting anything but pure chance type results to all of a sudden doing incredibly well. So that's my experience with that. Yesterday, someone who was probably here had this experience, and so occasionally there's enough time to do this. But I won't have any time to do this tomorrow. But those of you that want to get your brain waves measured and then compare to these various type of patterns that I showed, are certainly welcome to do that. It's free. There is a website that has the paper, mental access paper, with which actually is on Uri Geller's website. He had called me a number of years ago and said that, he does all this PK stuff, but he didn't know how to teach people to do PK. And so he wanted to put some of my papers on that site, on his site. So if you go through the web that way, you have to go through quite a few buttons to finally where it says learn how to do PK, and then you'll see some of my papers. I understand they don't print out real easily, so they have to read them online. But I guess that the other thing I'd like to share with you is this next slide. Now, first of all, what this is an attempt at describing what your brain waves go through when you go to bed, go to sleep. And I'm describing this primarily from the point of view of a narrow band person. Because if you think about it, the frequency band becomes very large for those people who have wide bandwidth frequency. Frequencies on this scale now. And so let's just use me as an example, because I have a narrow bandwidth brainwave pattern. And when I go to bed, my brainwave starts to go down, and I don't know, it's around 9 hertz that I lose consciousness or fall asleep. And then as I keep going down, I hit the special MAW window and have either, it's called by lots of things, REM, sleep, hypnagogic imagery, and or first dream, or first out-of-body experience. So as you go down in the normal circadian rhythm, this dips down in the delta and back up and down, possibly up to 20 times a night. Now, as you approach morning, or getting to sleep, the amount of dip down in frequency becomes less, and I always like to describe it as in Saturday morning when you sleep in and you sort of go in and out of sleep. What you're doing is possibly getting up to where you become a little conscious, and you're in and out of this window quite frequently. Now that's the best time to send your mind out to get answers, to get information, to do the most doing, because your brain is going in this pattern. So one time, years ago, even 20 years ago, our company, the company for which I work, put out a request for creativity ideas. They were finding, lack of creativity, and so they wanted articles in the company newspaper about creativity. And so, thinking that somebody might be interested, I went through this discussion, and you know, the whole idea of a bunch of engineers sleeping in and getting their creative moments just didn't feel right for an aerospace company. I have just a couple minutes more. I wanted to share another one of those creative ideas that I put out for the company newspaper. By the way, neither of these got published. But in studying healers and what they described and trying to, I'm not going to be able to go through all the details, but in California, the Santana winds blow, which causes a very strong positive charge to your body capacitance, and similarly the ocean, walking along the ocean, you get very strong negative charged body capacitance. And those of you who live in the dry country, you know if you get a large static electricity charge on your body, then to touch something, you get the spark, right? And so the issue in my space began to be, what is good? What is it good to have a large positive or large negative charge on your body? And I think there's lots of suggestion that the large negative body capacitance allows the mind to get out more easily and therefore more creativity and solve problems and so on. The large negative charge, the large positive charge tends to really shut you down. Normal physics, most people know that you take a rod and a leather rod or something and rub the rod, you get this positive charge. And similarly, if you want to get a negative charge, you use glass rod and the rod, and you get a negative charge. So rubbing that all together, that's a joke. I said, I wrote this paper that said, with all those ideas, that it's pretty clear that all these executives in management are walking around in their leather shoes on rugs and having large positive charges on their body. So, gosh, no wonder they need creativity training. And so I said there's only two solutions I can think of. One is get rid of the rugs, which of course most of you know the executives wouldn't give up their rugged offices, or get glass slippers. That didn't go down well with me. I thought I'd share that with you. See, tonight after the banquet, Charlie Tart's going to give the keynote address over in that other building, and then after that, I'm going to give the PK party. Some people call it spoon bending. I still call it PK party here, and we'll. It's a fun thing. It's everybody gets to experience some PK at various levels, and depending on how much time we have and the excitement that we can generate, we'll have a wild event tonight. So, are there any questions? Yes.
Curious about you showed the brain waves for an intelligent teenager. I wonder, have you ever done or have you seen brain waves for infant?
No, I've never done it. But people who make a living doing this probably have more information.
What about other animals, like dogs, cats, rats?
I've never hooked up with an animal. I have a hard enough hooking up women. You know, it's okay with men that are balding, but getting a spot with that, you know, hair. Yeah. I'm just, you know, I've never done that.
What effect do the cellular towers have on our roadway and close proximity to these towers?
Sitting on it, or how close?
Repeat the question, please.
Okay, she wants to know what the effect on humans of the cellular towers that are all around and so there's a whole bunch of literature about effective microwave radiation that and there's different thresholds of what different communities believe affects the human body. When I first got interested in that, it was in probably mid-70s, and there was a lot of discussion about monitors, computer monitors, and they were putting out a lot of radiation those days. There's definitely some thresholds where you can get damaging effects, and there are other people here that are more expert in it than I am. But the Russians had thresholds that were about an order of magnitude more severe in the sense of less allowable radiation than we did back in those kind of periods. And we didn't know why, but we since have found out a lot about various frequencies and amplitudes that are really damaging to the body. Now, from what little I know on that subject, I think the car industry became very concerned about that. It was 6 or 7 years ago, because they're putting cell phones in all the cars and various antennas. I believe that the normal placement of these antennas are sufficiently far away that they don't have any damaging effects on people. There are some people that are more sensitive to these kind of effects than others, but the bulk of the humans are well protected against that kind of radiation. That's a partial answer, but there's a lot of data on that by other experts that are here.
What's typical voltage available for an EEG?
Well, we're talking about, microvolts in terms of this kind of motion. It's, can't remember the exact number, 20 to 40 microvolts. So it's very small. Any kind of muscle movement, the people that get hooked up tomorrow did yesterday, if you just blink your eyes, you hear this huge electrical artifact that's caused. So any kind of movement creates, at least in my simple system, such major artifacts that it wipes out the actual EEG data. So, frankly, a lot of people get confused about they have some device that hooked up to a person and they have it running at some frequency, and then they are amazed that people seem to be induced into that frequency. Well, it turns out they're just picking up the signal from the device itself, and rather than the body, it's the voltage on the body is so by almost any electrical device, it just overwhelms the actual EEG from the brain. Now,
have you done tests with people in sensory deprivation?
No.
It's interesting to see where that arrow.
See, I have many applications, as most of you know. This is something I did because I was interested in it. And there's other people around here, like that are actually professionals that do this for a living. And they're the ones to ask you know, a million questions about all the parameters that they might look at. Have you done dogs?
No.
She hasn't done dogs, cats. Infants?
Yes, we have one.
Well, when she gives her talk tomorrow afternoon, you can ask her about infants. They are growing too. The brain stem is obviously growing, and you have to understand these effects. With another question, I'll take one more. Yes.
Have you ever tested anyone in your acupuncture treatment?
Actually, yes. There was a person who, by stimulating the acupuncture points electrically, believing he was putting this person into a certain state, but it turned out after I showed him that the EEG was actually picking up his induction frequency, not his brain was actually doing so. It's just another case of a lot of people get, because they don't understand all the artifacts possible, they get sometimes confused with what they're seeing in the office. Okay, hope that was interesting.